Hey, listeners, welcome back to Sustainability Street, our podcast on the intersection of commercial real estate and the world we live in. I'm your host, Therese Fitzgerald. As I've done for the past few years, I'm ending 2025 with a conversation with Liz Beardsley, Senior Policy Counsel for the U.S. Green Building Council, following her trip to the UN's Global Environmental Conference. COP30 was held last month in Belém, Brazil. But I've also spoken to Liz following her trips to Egypt, Azerbaijan, and Saudi Arabia. This year's COP, or Conference of the Parties, drew 56,000 registered attendees and 198 negotiating delegates. The U.S. did not send an official delegate to the negotiations, but U.S. subnationals and the private sector were there in force, and their presence made an impact on other countries, Beardsley said. This is always an interesting topic for me, and Liz is a super informative guest. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Liz. Thanks for joining me after your big trip to COP30 in Belém, Brazil.
Thanks, Therese. It's nice to see you.
Liz, you and I have done this for a few years after you've gone to COP. But for my listeners who may not know, tell us what COP is and how it's organized.
Sure, it's a good question. So COP actually stands for Conference of Parties, and the parties are the national governments who have signed on to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC as it's known. There's a lot of jargon and acronyms in this world. So under that framework agreement, every year the parties come together and hold a conference and continue to work on the items under that convention or treaty. The Paris Agreement was the big breakthrough agreement that was reached at a COP 10 years ago. And every year there's work done on implementing aspects of that agreement and introducing new initiatives and so on. So the COP at its core is a negotiation amongst the national governments, and there are formal groups that meet on the different work streams under those agreements and continue to work out the details. And then there are plenaries where all the national representatives come together and discuss and comment and eventually vote. And then that's kind of the negotiation side. There's also more of a conference side, which is pavilions and side events. And this is all of kind of the ecosystem of countries and organizations that are working on climate change issues. So there's the original point of those was to help provide information to the negotiators so they would be able to see what's happening and hear from scientists and practitioners and so on. And it's kind of evolved. Uh, it's a big part of the COP now, all of the side events, and it's a wide range of different activities. And then probably the third piece is the bilateral meetings. There are a lot of side meetings that are held at the COP, which can be quite important as well.
And it's 2 weeks.
It's 2 weeks. And actually, one thing that was distinctive about COP30 is that the main COP, this negotiations and the side events was held in Belém, as you said. But prior to COP, there were two related events. There was a local leaders summit that was held in Rio the week prior, where mayors from around the globe came together to talk about their climate work and really send a message to the main COP negotiators. So that was kind of a distinct pre-COP but related event. And normally they're also at the COP. So that was a little bit different, whereas there were not as many mayors at the COP proper because of this other event, but there were a lot of them there. It was more accessible, I think, at Rio. And They sent some strong signals to the negotiators. And and then the other was in Sao Paulo, where the business community came together. So often at COP, there's these kind of on the margin events. The Sustainable Innovation Forum is one, and there's others. And this time, that business concentration again was before COP in Sao Paulo. One of our partners, the Green Building Council Brazil, held a green building conference during that period as well to draw attention to green buildings as a solution. So that was a little bit of a different twist on things, but there were still a lot of people in Belém.
How many? About?
I don't know if I saw the final number, but it felt pretty full, certainly in the venue, and we certainly strained the capacity of the city in terms of hotel rooms, as you probably have seen in the news in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I did hear that. Um, so on the negotiating side, the U.S. did not send a delegate. Was there a lot of talk about that at the conference?
Yeah. So, I've been through this before. We were at the COP in the first Trump administration, and there was a very light delegation. They also did not have a country pavilion, and the US pavilion has been really important otherwise in other years, to showcase all of our science on climate, which is used by the world. So that's a really important point. What I would say is there was a much less discussion or questions from people from other countries than I've had in the past about what's happening with the US. I think once the election happened, the other countries knew this was coming,
Yeah.
and just so there wasn't a surprise. Um, Also, in one of the reasons we go to COP, one of our objectives, I should say, is to really amplify the engagement of the United States writ large. So the subnationals and the private sector were there in force. And I was just actually listening to a podcast by a global commentator, and like this isn't just me saying this, but it was quite noticeable throughout the conference how strong the U.S. non-federal delegation was. There were a lot of people from California. Governor Newsom was there in the
Right.
beginning and made some like very high-profile comments and events. From the Congress, there was a plan to have, I think, 18 members coming and a small Senate delegation, but with the ending of the shutdown and the need for the appropriations vote, they had to cancel at the last minute. So Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island came as the sole representative, elected official of the federal government. So he was there and did quite a few engagements in the time he was there. He was just running from event to event, talking about, his perspectives. And then the US private sector was there in force as well. So I think that was all really seen. In fact, we had an event on Monday, the 17th at 6 o'clock. It was, or sorry, 6:30 to 8 p.m. It was an official side event in a pretty
Mhm.
large room, and with the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, the Climate Registry, and EESI as our partners. And it was all US focused. So we're really trying to tell the story of innovation and action by the US subnational and private sector. And I mean, it was a full room, like all the way to 8 o'clock. Like people stayed and wanted to hear it. So I think that was quite successful and important. And I've also heard that as far as in the negotiating room, just anecdotally, that, it is a big loss. There have been times when US negotiators have been really strong and persuasive, and there's a lot of, if you've heard this term, like shuttle diplomacy. So,
Yeah.
it's like people are talking to their allies, or different countries have different connection and nexus points and points of common interest. And so when the US, which is engaged, in global trade, obviously, and other things, security, we can be quite influential. So that part was missing. And I heard anecdotally that some of the other large countries were sort of taking advantage of that gap in some of the negotiating process, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard one report that I guess this was outside of the negotiating tent, but that China had an impressive showing with renewable energy.
Yeah, I mean, they're the world leader in renewable energy.
Hmm.
So it's and it's interesting, like as the pavilions went, that's also a show of power. And that's always interesting to see what countries have pavilions and what they're emphasizing. So when you walked in the venue, China is one of the first that you saw, and it was massive. Um, they were they had like a photo spot. They had like a pretty big, audience section for sessions, and it felt very, I don't know, imperial, I guess is the word. They were giving away like little panda head things that were like seen all throughout the venue.
Yeah.
And some other stuff like that. But yeah, they were definitely China was had a strong showing in that sense. India was also a pretty big pavilion. On the other hand, like the ocean pavilion was quite prominent and really emphasizing the role of the ocean and our planetary boundaries and some of the core science that's helping inform where we stand with climate right now. So um, Turkey had a fairly prominent pavilion. Singapore had a really beautiful one. They have a real aesthetic with a lot of focus on sort of plants and art. So, but no U.S. pavilion. The Climate Registry did have a pavilion, and that was nicknamed the U.S. Pavilion. But that hosted a lot of the US centric events. So that was wonderful that they were able to step in.
Yeah, so it sounds like the U.S. had a relatively strong presence,
Yeah.
regardless of
Yeah.
what's going on in Washington. So there is a buildings dedicated pavilion, right? So what were some of the ideas and discussions going on there?
Yeah. So at the buildings, there's a buildings and cooling pavilion, and this is sponsored by the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. So our ultimate objective in going to the COPs, and we've been going since Copenhagen, if not before, but well before I came on board at USGBC 11 years ago, is to show support, encourage, and urge ambition
Hmm.
in dealing with climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. I mean, we believe that it's urgently needed and that we have the solutions. So that's really why we're there. Um, some of our objectives this year are to lead on key issues in the building sector, and I can talk more about that, really on scaling and on continuing to emphasize a holistic approach to buildings that gives multiple benefits. And then to amplify the US subnational and private sector presence, as I was just talking about. And lastly, to engage with our partners around the globe, whether it be building industry companies, other NGOs, finance as well, and member companies. So, as far as the building sector, a few interesting pieces. First
Hmm.
of all, this a couple years ago, the Buildings Breakthrough was launched, and that's part of this is where I get back into the like the jargon of the COP world, but under the UNFCCC, there's a breakthrough agenda. And the idea here was that certain sectors are really hard to abate or to reduce emissions, and
Hmm.
that we need something to like have a breakthrough and really accelerate work in those areas. So, for example, there's one for aviation fuel, there's one for cement and concrete. And so a couple of years ago, there was a buildings breakthrough that was formed. And this then uh, evolved into, I think, 5 different priority action areas. And of course, we formed like committees and steering committees
Hmm.
and working groups and all. And so those groups have been at work for about 18 months, I'd say, and now have some at this COP reported out kind of where each one stands and the progress being made. So USGBC, we sit on the steering committee for Priority Action One, which is standards and certifications. And we just released a report, I guess a draft report on the definition. And what we were trying to do here is develop a common shared definition around what is a near zero emission and resilient building.
Hmm.
And that's actually the aspiration of the buildings breakthrough is uh, that near zero emission and resilient buildings are the normal by 2030. So it's very aspirational. But the idea is to, create these different resources and guidance, and then be able to use that to work with national governments to implement policies and programs that will make a difference. We are used to building regulation in the US to varying degrees, but some countries don't even have, an energy code, and it's much more up to the market alone. And so there's really a room for national action in those places to make a difference and bend that curve down, as well as create resilience, which is, becoming more and more of a topic. So anyways, the Buildings Breakthrough reports were quite interesting. One of the other areas is on sustainable public procurement of buildings. So there's that action area, and then another one on capacity building. And we also help support that. There's a new portal of resources that's being launched soon. So we were talking about that and had different people from around the globe talking about some of the ways that they're trying to help train, architects, engineers, practitioners in how to build, these near zero emission buildings. So that was quite a good session. I think another exciting thing is we brought to the buildings pavilion the issue of healthy indoor air. Um, and we were part of a group of initial signatories to the Global Pledge on Healthy Indoor Air back during Climate Week at the UN. And this initiative is really trying to draw attention to this issue, the health impacts of unhealthy indoor air, and also the solutions, and trying to elevate that. That pledge was, had a mix of kind of academia and public health world and some countries and a little bit of the building sector, but we really thought that COP was a perfect place to really get the word out more broadly. And so I think that was very well received. We got a lot of comments on that. And one of the key researchers from the Global Pledge is from Australia. So we also participated in an event at the Australia Pavilion that, again, helped amplify what that pledge is about.
You mentioned near zero building. Is that a relatively new term? Is that the new term versus net zero?
Yes. So that is like the specific language in the buildings breakthrough. And I think it's around 40 countries signed on to this language that they would endeavor that near zero emission and resilient buildings are, the new normal by 2030. And that's perhaps why we spent, a year talking about the definition and where we ended up. There are a lot of different definitions out there, and people feel rather passionately about their definition.
Hmm.
But to me, participating in that steering committee, the guiding factor was these countries that really haven't gotten started yet on buildings policy. And some of those are the same places where there's, massive population increases and there will be a lot of new construction in the next 20 years. So it's really a chance to get it right. But we have to, every country is different. There are differences by culture, by wealth, by population, and all the other factors. So we need to be both ambitious and somewhat flexible to individual country circumstances. Some are much more resourced as far as like technical capacity, et cetera. So what we ended up doing was trying to create, this clear definition of, near zero emission
Mhm.
and resilient building, but then provide building blocks, which are sort of the elements of what goes into a near zero or net zero building. And those are all defined. So, you know, operational energy efficiency, um, building envelope, embodied carbon, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of pieces to that. And that will help educate and like open these conversations with the national government. So this, and I don't like to use the acronym, but definitely people in this like global buildings policy world are, and that's the NZERB.
Ends there.
Near zero emission resilient building.
Okay.
Yes. Um, but yeah, I think we absolutely can build near zero and many times net zero buildings. I think, there are differences of opinion on how much do you count embodied carbon, and we certainly feel like that needs much more attention. It, you know, so
Yeah. There are a lot of components of a
exactly.
near zero building, I guess. You mentioned resilience, and I had read something that people feel that at some people feel at COP there was more of an emphasis on resilience and adaptation rather than, getting to the actual causes of climate change.
Yeah, I think resilience and adaptation have been gaining attention and work at COPs for a couple of years. Trying to remember which one. There was one COP right after the flooding disaster in Pakistan. I think that was around 3 years ago. And that year, the Pakistan pavilion had on it like a huge banner that said, what happens in Pakistan doesn't stay in Pakistan. And what they're really saying is like, this is like at one level, this is humanity. Like when thousands of people die and cities are destroyed and because of climate strengthened disasters, this affects everyone. And as well, like the climate migration issue was really front and center for a couple of years. So I think there is much more appreciation, as well as with science telling us, I think depending where you read, we're already at, 1.2 or 1.3 degrees, that we have to adapt at the same time as we continue to try to reduce emissions and reduce the warming as much as we can. There was actually a report. So this year, the it was another cycle of the countries submitting their nationally determined contributions. And that's where basically the countries pledge of how they can reduce emissions towards the 1.5 degree
Hmm.
goal. Um, the NDCs, as they're called, sorry, continue to get better in quality and more ambitious and more detailed. So they are getting closer to real action and implementation. And this was the implementation COP was kind of the goal. They're still not adding up. They're not enough. If everything that was pledged is completed, it's still not enough to get to 1.5, but it is a step in the right direction. However, I was going to say is there was an analysis of where we are today, compared to had the Paris Agreement not happened and just countries continued on the trajectory at that time. And they do show like a significant down curve in emissions and warming as a result of what's happened. And as you said, like renewable energy deployment around the world has been a huge part of that. Now that solar is less expensive than fossil fuels, And wind is also competitive, and there's a lot of advantages to some of these other technologies, plus all kinds of other things, geothermal, like small nuclear reactors, et cetera, biofuels. There are a lot of technologies that are being scaled now, and that is making a huge difference.
Yeah, they're meeting some challenges here in the United States, but
Yes, there
but
are headwinds, as people
they are
say.
moving forward. Yes.
But yeah, but to your question, yeah, there's so much more on resilience. There are like several resilience hubs, and I think that's starting to be certainly there were a couple of sessions at the Billings Pavilion on that topic and really elsewhere as well. And one of the interesting things I went to was a small roundtable with multinational development banks around resilience finance. And I think that was also one of the pieces that did come out of the final agreement at COP was a tripling of the commitment to developing countries of adaptation finance. But in this multinational development bank session, they were talking about um, and those banks do a lot of tracking. So like they have their different financial products and loans, and they're essentially funding national governments in the less developed countries to do different kinds of infrastructure, and that includes buildings as well as other things. And some of that has a mitigation orientation. Some of it now increasingly they're being asked to work on adaptation at the same time. So, so that was kind of interesting. They're still working on what the criteria should be and having a common framework. So that's the kind of thing that we'll be commenting on to help them push them towards something really meaningful when it comes to the buildings part of their portfolios.
And when you say countries make pledges, are they making pledges to reduce their use of fossil fuels or making pledges of money, or what are the
Yeah.
pledges?
So the nationally determined contributions are kind of the bottom line is the emissions reduction, the greenhouse gas
Hmm.
emissions reduction that the country is saying they will achieve over time. And as they get more detailed, like then you can see how they're planning to achieve that. Is it from transportation? Is it from decarbonizing the electric grid, et cetera? So that's sort of the how is where you kind of get into seeing the extent to which it's pulling back from fossil fuel. But by and large, I mean, that has to be part of it just based on the science. Fossil fuels are the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And sources like methane, also a factor that can be from agriculture, from oil wells and or gas wells and other things as well. So, but that's the idea that each country's NDC will sort of inventory what their emissions are now and their goal or what they think they can commit to reducing, and then hopefully, like more and more, they're saying how they plan to get there.
Great. Um, so what were some of the big takeaways for you? What's making you optimistic about moving forward?
A couple of things. I think there was a lot of innovation on display, and as much as we understand that we need to do more faster, I mean that was the focus. It was really on scaling and and doing more, not doing less. Perhaps some of the countries in the back rooms, that's what they were after with their negotiations from some of the fossil fuel states, but by and large, I think most of the world is still moving forward, and there was like a really strong spirit of that. I don't know if you read, but there was, in terms of the final text. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's all these work committees, and they kind of are working on different pieces of the Paris Agreement to be able to implement them. And then also, typically at a COP, they call it a cover decision, which is a text of, a few pages to 10 pages, something like that, that kind of summarizes what's agreed, and that's a consensus document. And they there were a lot of different versions. Is not atypical, but there was a big push, and one of the drafts had in it the language about a roadmap to transition away from dependence on fossil fuel. This was proposed by Brazilian President Lula. He visited the venue and made a push for this. And as it shook out, about, I think, 80 countries were strongly in favor of this language, and about 80 countries were against it. So there was a stalemate for a few days, and that specific phrasing was dropped. But in its place, there was a compromise that's a little vaguer reference to work to implement the UAE decision. So that was from the UAE COP, where it was the first in Dubai, and that was literally the first time that fossil fuels were named in a cover decision, believe it or not. So in that one, it recognized the need to transition. And so the idea was, now let's take that forward and say, let's do a roadmap on how we transition. And I think the thinking of President Lula and others was that, this is like scientifically what we have to do, but we also recognize, some countries are fossil fuel importers. So what's their energy going to look like? Some are exporters. That for them, that might be the main finance for the national government, or the public finance. It could be a big job center. So there's different situations for different countries, and that having this roadmap would help kind of sort out the economic and the social side of transition. It's not just switching out energy fuels. Otherwise we would have done it by now. So I think this idea of a roadmap, even though it didn't get named in the final text, got a lot of momentum, and I think we'll hear more about it. In fact, I think President Liu is going to take that to the G20, and so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Yeah. So I think that's hopeful, that movement. Yeah.
Great. Well, Liz, thank you so much. I always appreciate hearing about the conference and your insights. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for this opportunity to speak with you, Therese.
And thank you, listeners, for joining me on Sustainability Street. If you have any comments about this episode or suggestions for episodes in 2026, please reach out to me at therese.fitzgerald@cpe-mhn.com. And happy holidays.